All right, hi everybody. Welcome to Module 2, where we'll take a look at what police can do, what their authority is, and what restrictions there are on their authority. So this is what our agenda will look like for this week's module. Like I said, police authority, what jurisdictions exist, and what complications having different jurisdictions can present, but also just what is a jurisdiction in terms of law enforcement. Some police stats. We'll look at how many different types of agencies exist, number one, and what types of size departments exist, who is generally coming into law enforcement, and some of the educational backgrounds and demographic information there. We'll look at the certification process for becoming a certified peace officer, and we'll keep it more tailored to Washington State, and the general hiring process, and then we'll wrap it up for the week. So as you get into this module, you'll see some videos that will do a little bit more in-depth explanation of police authority and what's available for officers in relation to like stop and detaining or arrest authority, and we'll look at what's the difference between reasonable suspicion and then probable cause. So briefly, just to give some context to the discussion for this lecture, law enforcement has to have at least a minimum standard of reasonable suspicion before they can stop or detain anybody. That could be to initiate a traffic stop or something to do like a police citizen contact on the street. If they actually have the ability to stop and restrict movement of that person, they have to have reasonable suspicion. And that's quite different than what probable cause is. And I will refer you to the Module 2 videos that are in Canvas that will do a really good job of explaining that. But at a high level, reasonable suspicion is more likely than not. And probable cause is actually having articulable facts and evidence to support and making an arrest. So those are different thresholds. An example of reasonable suspicion might be an officer driving and they're traveling at the speed limit and a car next to them is passing them. So they have reasonable suspicion that it's more likely than not that that car is speeding. Now they might also have a speed measuring device like a radar or LiDAR, and that would give an exact number of the speed of the vehicle. Again, more likely than not that it's that exact speed. So that's one example that would be articulable for the officer to say, this is the reason why I'm stopping you. You have broken or likely have broken this infraction, and then they have the authority legally to stop and detain that person for the purposes of the investigation for whatever that alleged crime or infraction might be. So for the purposes of our example, a speeding ticket, it would be the reasonable amount of time necessary to write a speeding ticket, or if in the course of that contact the officer starts to identify other crimes that might have been committed or are being committed, then the scope of that authority can also expand from there. And that's where, if there's, again, more articulable facts and evidence that the police officer can gather, they might elevate that into actual probable cause for an arrest. Again, that's a high-level brief synopsis. You'll get more as you go through Module 2 in Canvas, but for the purposes of the discussion today, just understand that broadly speaking, police authority is going to come from the officer witnessing or being provided reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Okay, when we look at police jurisdictions, it's really an important thing to understand the complexity and a lot of the legal requirements. So when we first look at the legal requirements, a jurisdiction is provided to a specific agency, and so they would have what's referred to as the right of first refusal. That's really the agency's opportunity to claim an investigation. They're attesting that this occurred within our legal jurisdiction, and then we're either going to take our right to investigate that, or we could decline that and offer it to another agency who could also have jurisdiction to do that investigation. So in Washington State, if you're a certified police officer, you have arrest authority for the entire state. So if a crime occurred in Walla Walla and the suspect drives outside of the city limits of Walla Walla, the Walla police officer can arrest that person no matter where they go, as long as they're in Washington state. It does get a little bit more complicated if they were a enrolled tribal member and it's on tribal lands. And we'll kind of talk about the tribe here in a little bit. But as long as they're a certified police officer and it's in Washington state, they can make that arrest. They just need to understand what the jurisdictional boundaries are. So we'll kind of get into that. So you have different badges and agencies represented on the screen. You have, you chose Walla Walla because that's where the community college that we're talking about is located, right? So you're probably familiar with the Walla Walla Police Department. They have the jurisdiction or functional authority and responsibility to investigate crimes and incidents that would occur within the municipality of Walla Walla. So within the city limits of Walla Walla, that is going to be their primary focus and their areas of responsibility. If a crime occurs outside of the city limits, but within the county of Walla Walla County, then that would be deferred over to the sheriff's office. So the sheriff's office has the authority of the more rural area of anything that occurs in their county. That now starts to get complicated because within Walla Walla County, you have highways and state routes that run through it. So you have the state patrol that has functional authority and responsibilities of things that occur on state routes, highways, interstates, not obviously in Walla Walla, but in other parts of the state. And so you have now a little bit of same shared jurisdictions where maybe the highway runs through the county and the city. So who's going to handle this? And so that's where you can start to see there's some complexities. And what needs to happen is the agency that has the right of first refusal needs to either enact that right and defer it, or they're going to keep the case and do the investigation. So again, important legal distinctions on who's going to do what, but they can be very impactful later on for a case. Also represented here on the page, you have Fish and Wildlife. They're certified police officers. They can make arrests, but they primarily are hired, and their responsibilities and focus is to enforce, fishing and hunting, wildlife types of crimes and infractions. But they can go across the entire state and they can arrest people for DUIs and domestic violence and any number of types of crimes that might occur usually within a state park is going to be their area of focus. Then, and I promise we'll get back to it, you have the tribe. So lots of different tribes in Washington state, and typically they each have their own police force, which will be the ability for a tribal police officer to arrest or take enforcement on an enrolled tribal member on tribal lands. So they are sovereign nations. So a local or state certified police officer would not be able to arrest an enrolled tribal member on the tribal property. So there needs to be a liaison with the tribal police. And there's always constant legal changes in this regard. In the legislative session that's currently going on, there is an extradition bill that's been proposed on how an enrolled member, if arrested by an agency and they seek extradition because they might be in a jail that's on the tribal land, how that would interplay. So those types of agreements and discussions are ongoing, and again, it's very legally complicated, but understand that the tribal police department, again, primarily focused on tribal lands for enrolled members of the tribe. Then you have federal agencies. There's over 65 federal enforcement agencies, I should say, that have police officers. A couple of those are represented here: Department of Justice, the FBI. I'm sure familiar with ATF. Less likely known is that you also have commissioned officers with the IRS that do criminal investigations. There's just so many federal agencies, and they even create more occasionally that come online. Interpol is on here to represent that there's obviously international police forces, but Interpol is more of a database than an actual police agency, where they aren't going to come with an officer to arrest you, but Interpol will flag people that are traveling internationally using databases and exchanges with all of these different jurisdictions. So again, important legal distinctions to know which jurisdiction has the functional or legal authority to make an arrest or to perform an investigation, and then how do they exchange that information or evidence or the arrested person between those jurisdictions. In Washington State, you have municipal courts, you have district courts, you have superior courts. You also have federal courts for the federal agencies and federal charges. So again, depending on which agency is doing the investigation and who may be filing the case, it's going to go to a different type of court as well. So now that we have kind of a general idea that there's local, city, municipality, police officers, you have counties, you have states, you have federal, you have tribal, which also utilize the FBI to do some of their investigations. All these different police jurisdictions are also made up of very different police department sizes. So the graphic here on the screen kind of helps demonstrate that over the 12,000 police departments in just the United States, the vast majority are actually fewer than 25 employees. So you're talking about very small police departments make up the majority of all law enforcement. Then the next graphic there, the 20% range of police departments are between 25 and 100 officers. And then the largest of more than 100 employees are actually very few. They are about 5% of law enforcement departments that are out there. So the state patrols, if you will, the large agencies like Washington State Patrol or Seattle Police Department, they're very few, but they have obviously a large number of officers. But the majority of all law enforcement is actually represented by very small, fewer than 25 police officer departments. So when we consider then we have a huge number of very small departments, who are these officers that are becoming certified police officers? This graphic helps kind of demonstrate over the years what the diversity looks like. And if you're looking close, it hasn't changed dramatically since, the late 90s, and the numbers are basically unchanged even to today's standards. Primarily, that 70-ish% are white officers, about 11 or 12% are black officers, about the same 12.5% Hispanic. The other could be, multiple mixed race, and then unknown is somebody didn't disclose what their race would be. And then there's also kind of the same breakdown. This is from 2013, but you can see it in just another way that, you're looking more than 2/3 of most law enforcement agencies are white officers, which, and when we look at later the next slide, how that breaks down over the general population, we'll take a look at that here. So how does that compare to the general census population? That's what this graphic represents here. It trends similar. On the left of each one of these bar graphs is the census, and then to the right is the police population breakdown. Very close in 2013 on the census and the police for black officers. You'll see there's a decline though in Hispanic, and then in the other minority groups is a significant lower number. We'll kind of examine maybe why that might be in the future slides here. So when we take a look at diversity demographics and why that is important for law enforcement to consider or at least be aware of, this graphic helps kind of demonstrate that. So you can see the breakdown across ethnic demographics, where there's a very large disparity between black and Hispanic civilians on their willingness to report crimes. And the reason why then diversity within law enforcement is important is to kind of peel back the onion, if you will, on why would some folks be hesitant in calling the police if they're witnessing a crime or if they're a victim of a crime. And part of it could be maybe they were a participant in the crime. Maybe they have some criminal liability and they don't want to call because they might be included in that investigation. Or it could be their perception would be that they may not be treated fairly by law enforcement. And so that has to be a consideration that you're open to as we look at these statistics, which have remained pretty consistent over the years. This is from 2016, but continual studies are done on this, and it's remained fairly consistent over time. So you have to start looking at why are different demographics less likely to call the police. And especially when you then compare some of those numbers that, well, there are lower levels of diversity within police departments, and there's the potential where maybe you don't feel as comfortable calling the police if that police force that's going to come doesn't reflect the same type of national origins, skin color, belief systems, cultural backgrounds. Those all kind of play into it. So that's an important slide to just keep in the back of your mind for, why, as we talk about diversity and why that might be important in law enforcement. When we look at this slide where there is the disparity of why certain demographics don't call police, we should be wondering and trying to solve, how do we improve that? Because, all Americans at 72%, you would hope that anybody that's a victim of a crime or witnessing a crime would be willing to report that to police, and that they would feel comfortable with the police coming to help solve and help people. So another diversity group to look at is the composition between male and female workforce. And you'll see here that females make around 15 to 18% of the population for law enforcement. Now, this is taking into consideration the federal law enforcement, state, local, all of the different types of law enforcement agencies. And that number has remained fairly consistent as well since about the late 60s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was really the tipping point where law enforcement had a huge explosion in the number of females within the ranks. But after about the mid 70s, right into the 80s, that number's really stayed very, very consistent, and the delta spike just plateaus in the 80s and has even in some points declined to where we're at today. So you see here, by and large, it is a male-dominated workforce. So I'll put this slide on here. I think it's just an interesting demographical breakdown of the types of education and backgrounds that are within the law enforcement profession in police officers. So you see, obviously protective services type of education makes up nearly half. And then it's interesting, you go to a fair majority of folks are getting business degrees or social science, psychology, education, communications, engineering. Then it really breaks down from there, where there's a lot of diversity, but they're very small pieces of diversity as far as what were at least the education interests and backgrounds of folks that become police officers. Well, we've looked at some of the demographical information on, what are law enforcement agencies, how are they kind of built and made, who wants to be a police officer, and who's hired into those roles and positions. So we'll take a look now and talk about, what does a peace officer certification look like? So in Washington State, the commissioning authority, which provides the peace officer certification, that's all done by the Criminal Justice Training Commission. You'll hear it commonly referred to CJTC. They're headquartered out of Burien on the west side, which is near Seattle. And their whole function as a state agency is to certify and maintain those certifications, like ongoing training for the police officers in Washington State. So you can see here on the slide, part of that certification process is to investigate or to decertify if there's qualifying complaints on a police officer. They have a board that does those investigations and those reviews and hearings. You can, on your own, go and look at these different RCWs. But CJTC has a list of requirements in the number of hours, the types of instruction and classes, and minimum training requirements to become a certified police officer in the state, and as well to maintain that certification. So you can see here there are different engrossed state bills that change the certification process and mandates, as well as what can decertify a police officer, and what that means if you're decertified to ever be hired into law enforcement again, whether that's this state or any state in the United States. And those laws continue to change. A couple years ago, there was a substantial change to where if you're decertified in one state, you may not be able to be certified in any state. And so there's a lot of those challenges and changes that continue to go through legislation. So CJTC, they're the certifying body that gives the peace officer certification, or the ability for somebody who's hired to be a police officer to have the authority to go out and actually do the job. However, you have to first be hired by an agency. And so here we're kind of looking at what is the hiring standards in Washington state to even be considered for the job of being a police officer. And I should say that CJTC certifies all police officers, with the caveat that if you were hired by the Washington State Patrol, the Washington State Patrol is the only entity in the state that has their own law enforcement academy. And they're actually, if you're a trooper, you get a dual commission. So you get a commission through the Washington State Patrol, which CJTC views that as being meeting or exceeding their standards. So you'll be certified under the CALIA standards for the State Patrol, and then you also have the state CJTC certification. So just a little bit of nuanced difference there. However, if you were hired by Walla Walla, you can't go to the Washington State Patrol Academy. You have to go to the CJTC Belia Academy. So just understand that all other law enforcement officers in the state will go to the Belia Academy, and only state troopers go to the State Patrol Academy. So with that, hiring standards, they can vary from agency to agency. However, what can't vary are the Revised Code of Washington, which is RCW. Those are the laws that are written into the books on what the state mandates a police officer to have a minimum qualification level. And so when we talk about some of the standards and requirements, there's requirements on how and what's required to get the certification, and then also what background checks have to include. And so this slide helps kind of demonstrate that. So criminal history check, you have to check that against national decertification data banks. So that goes into if you were a police officer in a different state and then you were decertified, then in Washington state you would never be able to be hired or employed as a police officer. Employment history, that's going to obviously look at if you've been employed other places, if you had any complaints or discipline records that would obviously come against you in the background process. An impeachment check with prosecutor's office, that would be if you've ever lied under oath for anything as a personal citizen or as it might relate to performing another job. Social media accounts, there's a review of any and all social media accounts. Citizenship verification, a psychological examination, and a recommendation by a qualified professional who does the psychological exam, and then a polygraph examination, which is a series of questions that would indicate deception if the subject taking the test were to attempt to lie on those types of questions. So the list that was on the previous slide, that's the minimum that an agency has to accomplish just to conduct the background process of their hiring of an employee. So it's a high expectation, and then we look at this is a flow chart of just the Washington State Patrol's hiring process, which is likely mirrored pretty much by any department anywhere in Washington state. So we'll just kind of show how this might flow through the process. Somebody will submit an application, they will then get an opportunity to go take a written test, which most agencies, they contract with public safety testing, so they'll go take a written and a physical test. If they pass the test, then that's great. You move on to the next step. If you didn't pass, depending on that, there might be a requirement for a certain amount of time to expire before you can apply again. Some agencies have that, some don't. But let's say you pass, then you would have a pre-polygraph interview. That basically is the first step of weeding out people. So if you answered to any felony drug use type of things, any criminal activity, it's really screening for a lot of those types of questions early on in the process. If you pass that, then you'd actually go to the full polygraph. If you pass that, then the polygraph is reviewed by someone in the higher rank. They would initiate a background check. You can obviously pass or not pass the background check, which would entail all of the things that we talked about in the previous slide. Then again, for the State Patrol, there's some internal policies and reviews that would happen. Assuming you pass all of the internal processes, you would get a conditional offer of employment. Then you get sent over for that psychological examination, because there's privileged information that comes out of those. So you have to have the conditional offer before you can do that. Then after the psychological, if you pass that, you would go to a medical exam to make sure that you're healthy enough and fit for duty. And then if you pass that, you would ultimately be hired. So you can see it's a very long, detailed process, lots of opportunities for failure. And so when we look at, again, who wants to be in law enforcement, you would have to have a really strong desire to do this job if you were going to submit to all these different tests and processes where there's a high likelihood, at least on your first opportunity of taking these tests, that you may not be successful. All right, so we covered a lot of kind of high-level topics this week, and as we go into more of the module, please make sure that you're watching the videos that are included in Canvas. There's going to be a lot more discussion and specific examples for reasonable suspicion, probable cause. Obviously the discussion questions and the writing assignment will all be found there. But hopefully this is helpful to get kind of a more contextual understanding of how different law enforcement agencies work with each other and what their responsibilities are, for jurisdictional issues. And then next week we'll dive into more of the actual legal processes for law enforcement. So we'll take a look at the Revised Code of Washington and Washington Administrative Code to understand where are laws, created, and what does that enforcement process look like. So enjoy the module, and I look forward to seeing you by the end of the week.